U.S. Custom officials say that women are responsible for more than 60% of the flow of drugs across the U.S.-Mexican border. Today on Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Elaine Carey joins me in examining women in the drug trade and organized crime. For more than 100 years, the U.S. has been in an unrelenting war on drugs, and little has been noted about the role that women play locally and internationally. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I am your host, Lee Artz. I'm joined today by my guest, Dr. Elaine Carey, who is the Dean of the College of Humanities, Education, and Social Sciences here at Purdue Northwest. We're going to talk about her work in Latin American history, specifically an article of women drug traffickers and organized crime. You got your Ph.D. in Latin American history from the University of New Mexico. You've been doing this a while, but I'd really like to talk about the most recent essay that was published in a social history journal. So
Great.
Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I've known of women and the attempt to correct history and the lack of understanding of the role women played in revolutions and building communities in the whole history of Latin America. But this is a whole new area. You're trying to recover the history of women in the drug trade. I guess my question is why? I mean, what was your interest? Why did you feel that this was something that needed to be investigated?
Well, part of asking a question regarding women, so if you ask a different question, if you pose a different question of the same materials, you will start to see what's there. So part of my experience as somebody who was finishing high school in the state of Florida during the midst of the drug wars, I was very familiar with hearing stories about women in the drug trade. Mm-hmm. And this is in the mid-1980s. Being a Latin American historian who's worked on women and gender history through my entire career, is I also recognize that women control the informal economic sector or the secondary labor market. And that
explain that. Wait, don't go for it. The
okay.
Informal sector means what?
So that sector means women who are street vendors, maybe selling chicle, bubble gum, small electronics,
outside
food,
the normal retail structure. Okay.
Exactly, and they may actually have a stand or a small area. Maybe they're selling out of their house, or they could actually be walking on the street and selling these items. If you include that area, that also includes a prostitution of selling their bodies. So if women dominate that, and you can go any place in Latin America, and women control the informal markets, the street markets. In fact, in Mexico, the street markets unions have long been led by women. But if you factor that in, if they control that, which is, especially if in prostitution, it's dangerous. It's dangerous personally, it's dangerous on a host of levels, so you can also become very ill. Why wouldn't they be in drug trafficking? Why wouldn't they be successful in those areas if they dominate the other areas? Because selling drugs, just like selling your body, is illegal, it's a crime. So why wouldn't this be? And so that was the question. So I just posed a question based on that economic analysis about women.
Was that also partly related to the general understanding or the media depictions of the drug trade, that it was largely dominated by Pablo Escobar or some MS-13 or some other gangs that were all led by the macho men, and the women were kind of ancillary to that?
Definitely. I mean, it was there. It was hiding in plain sight. So if you look at Terence Popa's book, The Drug Lord, in which he talks about a prominent drug lord who controls the plaza. The plaza is controlling the ports of entry, deciding who gets to move what products illegally through those ports. Well, if you read those books closely, and there's lots of them, then you see women are there. They're lieutenants in the organizations, they maybe run a particular part of the organization, or their mothers are involved, or their sisters, or their wives. So they were there. It's just no one was looking at their role at I would say, historically and in the contemporary. Now more people are paying attention, but they were there.
I kind of wonder why they weren't recognized. Is it just part of the general displacement of women's role in history in general, so this is just one aspect of that, or is there something more about the, again, the depiction of drug trafficking as a particularly violent, a particularly underground, a particularly aggressive, which has to be identified with the macho male, and women wouldn't have a place or weren't capable of running this kind of business?
Well, there's part of it is that anyone who becomes a leader of a drug organization, a DTO, or what we might say the leader of our cartel, they're an exceptional person.
Yeah.
The majority of people in the drug trade are at the low levels of the drug trade. They are low-level dealers, they may be overseeing a stash house or something like that, or the majority, obviously, who intersect are users and addicts. So if we're looking at the market and looking at the drug trade as an entire enterprise, there are very few people who rise to the top. Mm-hmm. And yes, that means there are a few men, and along with those few men are a few women. So if we're looking at numerically, yes, you would say that if we're looking at population breakdown between men and women in a particular country, should women hold 51% of the leadership in drug cartels, that's not really a great argument, because if we're looking at the business itself in its entirety, we are going to see women at all levels. And so part of that is the majority of men involved in policing. They are men, so as I mentioned. So for them to say, it has a different meaning to say, wow, you know, I had this $1 million bust and I arrested this elderly grandmother, which are some of the women that we're talking about. That doesn't carry the same weight as to say, hey, I've taken down somebody like Pablo Escobar, for instance, or Chapo Guzman. But women beginning very early on in the 1930s and in the 40s, they're being denounced. They are being targeted, not just in Mexico, and that's where my research focuses, is on Latin America, but also in the United States too. So there were women in all levels of the drug trade. But again, it's what gets placed in the media is a little bit different. And frequently men and women are working in partnership together. You know, it's a perfect partnership. I mentioned in the article a drug boss in Mexico City, Lola Chata, Maria Dolores Esteves, who was one of the big bosses in Mexico City from the 30s until her death in the late 1950s. She had what we would call a perfect partnership. Her husband was a former cop, and he was recognized as good a drug trafficker as she. She's slightly better. And so, because he wasn't in Mexico City, his base was in another town that was in a neighboring state. So that's where her stash houses were, it's where her distribution, some of her labs, things like that. They were not necessarily in the same area, but both of them are identified by Mexican authorities and U.S. authorities as being.
And that's what we don't hear.
And that's what we don't hear, these perfect partnerships,
Well, one of the things that struck me when reading the essay was how you talked before about the informal economy, about how much of the drug trade, at least in Mexico, not the drug trade that came to the U.S., was almost run like mercados. I mean, little street outlets, and I think in one place you quoted somebody saying it was like Walmart, anytime, any place, we can get you some drugs. So,
well, in this case, in the case that I mentioned in the article, which is Dilia Patricia Buendia, who set up,
I'd like to talk about her some more.
Who actually, Mexico has historically had low levels of addiction compared to the United States. And this has been documented just about every decade beginning in the 1920s.
That's because they're exporting it here.
Right. And what she did is that the demand was here.
Yes.
Right? So we can't say, it's not as if they were exporting because there was no demand. The demand is here.
The market is here too.
The market is here and the demand was here. And the networks were here. So if we're looking at thinking of drug trafficking as an organized crime, the sophistication of organized crime here was what facilitated the distribution into major cities in the United States. That wasn't done by Mexicans.
Right.
That was done by others and facilitated by others who were here in the United States. So if we're looking at the production, that was in Mexico and the movement directly over the US-Mexico border. But after that, it was taken by other organizations that were based in the United States. In Buendia's case, is because in the late 1990s, as demand for cocaine begins to shift, there's greater demand for heroin and methamphetamines, then there's also an escalation of policing along the US-Mexico border. So what happens is there was in the market in Mexico excess cocaine, and she created a market in Mexico to absorb that excess cocaine. And that's where she established in one of the small
outside the urban area.
Outside the urban area, and it's urban, but it's a suburb of Mexico City, Ciudad Neza. She established a network of little shops or windows where they sold low-grade cocaine, where they never had, at a cost that was affordable to Mexicans in that particular part of Mexico City.
You may have preferred to export it to the U.S., but not being able to means you have to find some
You
market.
have to absorb, right, that was the idea, to absorb. And she was involved in other illicit, she'd been selling marijuana as well as other things, it was her location, but she essentially becomes a major drug trafficker, recognized in the U.S. in the late 1990s by U.S. authorities.
Why would the U.S. be interested in her if her distribution is all in Mexico?
Well, part of this is that they were studying, people who are studying drug trafficking are looking not only just at those, trafficking doesn't mean that you have to move across a border. You can also, a controlled space can be within a city. And if you're moving cocaine, you are involved in trafficking, just as if you're moving people.
Right.
It doesn't mean that you're moving them from one state to another or one nation to another. It's that you're involved in illicit and moving an illicit commodity.
So the U.S., the Drug Enforcement Agency is interested in trafficking, even though it's has nothing to do with the U.S.?
Right.
So it's
this was starting to be studied to say, look, that what the demand changes in the United States, what does that also do in Mexico?
Okay.
And so a country that has had historically low rates of addiction started to see in certain areas those levels of addiction skyrocket.
So again, in reading your essay and the history, it suggests that women were involved in the drug trade in the 30s. It changes up in the 90s when we're talking about these markets. So maybe an overview of what were your findings. You mentioned some percent that was not the percent, but how many women and how broad was this involvement in the drug trade from the 30s up till now? So
it actually emerges in the wake of the Harrison Act, which is passed in 1914, which is to control the distribution of opioids and opiate derivatives. And in part, this is what triggers what would be our modern day drug war. So we're in now 100 years into this.
The war without end.
And so what I did, one summer I sat in a library and ran searches, and I was looking for women who were involved, and I was specifically looking at heroin, and the reason is because heroin use, the reason that heroin increases with the Harrison Act is because we had a large number of doctor-maintained and addicted addicts. So these were people who had been
Suddenly it becomes illegal, so again that creates an illegal market.
Exactly,
yes, okay.
So that creates the illegal market.
Right.
So I started to find the first women in 1915 and 1916 who were involved in organizations that were making $1 million or more per year on the basis of the police documents. And so that happens in 1916. Now, of course, there are other women, and I was looking for women who were involved in large organizations that were involved in trafficking.
Not the women in the markets, but the women that ran
But
the
there were
organization.
women who were either equal partners or were leading these types of organizations. And so the first ones that I find are almost immediately. So towards the end of 1915 and 1916, because again, they had to have time to accrue the ability to make $1 million. And I base that on $1 million because that is how it's reported by policing agencies.
Well,
they don't say
in
something.
1915 is a lot
more money than it, but still today, if they say, there was an arrest of an organization that was making $1 million to $2 million a year, they still report that.
Okay.
And so that's why I use that. But there were other women involved. So the first women I start to find, they're in the US, they're in Mexico, they're in Canada. But what I wanted to do is to write a history is I had to find enough evidence around women. And so some of the women I talked about were women who were running such large organizations that there was a large body of evidence in Mexico, in the United States, and in Canada.
So it's extensive, it's been long-lasting, more than 100 years. Women have been central to this. One thing that I didn't get, and it wasn't supposed to be a novel-like, it's a research essay, but how do they establish the power? I mean, it's like, you talk about connections. One of the things that struck me, there was a lot of connections with police and other authorities, government, but I didn't see that it was particularly based upon violence or force or demanding recognition of the queen of the bodega or something. So was it more relationship based? Was it more corruption based, or was the violence and the rest that we might see on Narcos or something?
Everything and all of it.
Okay.
So initially, what frequently happens is women are brought into the business by their family members. So one woman I've written extensively about, Lola Chata, or Maria Dolores Estevez, her mother sold morphine and marijuana in one of the markets in Mexico City. She was running those drugs for her mother within the city.
Okay.
She eventually, during the Mexican Revolution and starting in 1910, somehow along, because she's born at the beginning of somewhere around 1900 to 1905, and she ends up going to the U.S.-Mexico border to Ciudad Juarez. And then she ends up back in Mexico City. So she learns about most likely trafficking on the border, but she has this influence within her family.
Right.
And this is contemporary too, that young men and women are brought into the business sometimes by their family members, by their mothers and fathers who train them. They may actually be introduced to a potential partner to consolidate more influence or more power within the drug economy in Mexico or even in the United States. So these things happen. So women have, family connections. They may bring their children into the business. They may not. They grow it. One ethnographer who I work with has documented that they grow this more slowly because they do face greater competition and they potentially face violence from their male competitors, particularly in the contemporary market. But they also use just corruption, bribery, co-option of police agents, as I mentioned with Maria Dolores Estevez. She actually married a former police officer, or they put them on the payroll. And that's frequently. So if a police officer is receiving a very low salary, so how much does it cost to have somebody maybe look the other way for a period of time?
Well, that was one of the things that was strongly suggested in your essay also, was the connection that women, and by extension I guess men would too, with police and authorities. The suggestion is that this isn't something that's on that side of the law, but the law in terms of representation. Officials, police on all levels had to participate, if not looking the other way, if not directly participating, at least tolerating or allowing otherwise this couldn't happen. Even when you're talking about exporting to the US, I mean, there is no wall, but it still has to be, if you're talking that much movement, there has to be some collaboration.
And we've seen historical cases in customs and border patrol of cases of people working for drug organizations, so on the US side as well as on the Mexican side. But we also have to remember too, the reason we know about these cases is because of the people who are policing them, and that's how we learn about them, because they enter into the documents because of the work that they're doing. So yes, we have corruption, and co-opting the police and putting them on the payroll. At the same time, we have other police who are not on their payroll who are in fact investigating the police who are involved. So it's really complicated and messy, and that's what we do as historians. We look at the context and the complexity of a particular case. So it isn't something that it's just right or wrong or black or white. That it's that gray area that I find really interesting, and those complications, and this is one of them.
Yeah, it's hard to think of the drugs, and when they talk about the opioid crisis as being a gray area, but one of the things that interests me is media representations of Latino women, Mexican women. There's several stereotypes. One is the sultry seductress that's out to, manipulate the men. Then there's the one with the madre that takes care of the community and her children. This suggests that there might be another stereotype forthcoming, so that we have a female Pablo Escobar, so we can have this drug queen that is capable of running the empire. And is that one of the things that? Well,
we've seen it over and over again, like in the film Traffic, Catherine Zeta-Jones' character, where she takes over her husband's drug business because he's arrested. And she actually goes to meetings, and it's a great depiction of this very complicated, what does it mean to be involved in the drug trade? And here's another representation.
As a woman.
Right, yeah. But they're different, as we said, they're different stereotypical representations of men, too. We also have in Weeds, where we have, that's a great image of, a woman who's living in the suburbs, her husband works for the government, and he dies, and so she ends up selling weed, and then but becomes the basis of the show. But we see these other female characters. So I don't like to kind of talk about the stereotypes, because the fact is that women have an array of experiences in their lives, and historically and in the present. So the aspect is that, you're going to have all levels of kind of these perceptions about, and in some cases, women have used these to their advantage if they have said, in the case of Maria Dolores Estevez, she wrote a letter to the president's wife, and she makes an argument of, why are you attacking me? I'm a mother, and I'm a small business owner, and she had legitimate businesses, and I help people in my community. She used the language of mothering and being feminine and taking care of people, and she was. Yeah. Pablo Escobar did the exact same thing, though. Yes. But we don't sit there and say, kind of,
he doesn't have that
self-sacrifice.
Identity, right?
He didn't have that identity. She didn't have that identity either. She was recognized as a boss, but she was able to use this language. He used that language too, to say, look what I do for my community.
But the tropes of women as caring and gentle and peaceful were more available to her than they would be for Pablo.
Probably, yeah, definitely. And the level of violence, I'm not saying that women in the past didn't use violence, but the market is so much more lucrative now. And there are lots of changes going on. So there's a tremendous amount of competition.
So is this part of breaking the glass ceiling? So we're saying women can be criminals too? I mean, is this?
I'm not saying that women can be criminals too. I'm saying that women have interesting experiences just as men. And if we're looking at any type of economic activity, and the drug trade is an economic activity, women are there just like men. So I bring this up to journalists who are always talking about is some journalists were saying, why would women get in the drug trade? Men behave like dogs. It's like, men behave like dogs in many places. Well, why would the drug trade be unique? So that's part of the aspect. So I think it's more of thinking about what is happening in the drug trade, how does it work, and who are the people involved? And the people involved at all levels. It's very hard to find, as a historian, it's very hard to find those low-level people because they're a number. It's a minor arrest record. So it's very hard to do that, except through quantification. What I was interested in is really developing case studies around prominent women in the drug trade, because nobody had done that before.
Yeah, I know this is great. We could talk more maybe we will. I'd like to at some time pursue the gender differences in running the drug trade, because it's always argued that there are gender differences in the way that we function. I wonder if those are explicit or if they can be pulled out from what exists in the drug trade. But we're about at the end of our time, so I want to thank you, Dr. Carey, for coming and for writing Women Drug Traffickers and Organized Crime, which is in a social history journal recently. That's all the time we have on our program today. Thank you, Dr. Carey, for joining me on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Lee Artz. See you next time.